My name is Grace. They thought they buried the truth along with my grandmother, but I am the one who handed the judge my aunt's offshore accounts on a silver platter and watched my cousin Catherine's fake tears dissolve under oath like sugar in hot tea. It all started at the funeral. While the air smelled of lilies and lies, Aunt Stephanie smirked as she handed me a deed to a rotting pile of wood called the Gilded Cage. She had already filed the paperwork with the county clerk, ensuring the transfer was legally binding and final. Thinking she was trapping me with a liability I could never sell, she walked away with $1,500,000 in cash, thinking she had won. She did not realize, however, that I was already holding the match. Welcome to the When Karma Strikes channel. Today, I am going to tell you a story. But before that, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. The air was still thick with the scent of funeral lilies when I watched Stephanie and Gregory pull away in their pristine Mercedes. They were heading to a celebratory lunch at a 5-star bistro in downtown Asheville. I knew the place. It was the kind of restaurant where the appetizers cost more than my monthly rent, and the atmosphere was curated to make people like them feel like royalty. They thought they had settled the balance. They thought the rotting house was a consolation prize that would keep me quiet, while they carved up my parents' legacy like a Thanksgiving turkey. They were busy tasting expensive wine and laughing about the niece they had finally pushed out of the inner circle. I did not cry. I did not drive home to mourn the grandmother who had been my only shield. My grief was a luxury I could not afford right then. Instead, I drove straight to the Gilded Cage. The house sat there in the mountain fog, looking every bit like the rotting pile of wood Stephanie had described. But as an architectural historian, I see things they do not. I see the bones of a building. I see the history buried in the walls. And, most importantly, I see the paper trail. I walked into the dusty library and opened my laptop. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 28 years, and it was time to conduct a final audit. My credentials as a licensed architect and structural consultant were the only reason their development firm had any standing with the state board. They needed my certifications to prove their new luxury projects were compliant with Asheville's strict historical preservation codes. I logged into the state licensing portal at 11:51 p.m. I found exactly what I expected. Over the last 6 months, Gregory had used my digital seal and signature to sign off on 3 major safety permits for their upcoming Skyline Asheville development. These were documents I had never seen. Safety certifications for a multi-million-dollar luxury complex that I had not actually inspected. They had not just stolen my money, they had hijacked my professional identity to bypass a massive safety review process. They were not just greedy, they were dangerous. They were building a glass empire on a foundation of forgeries. I did not call Stephanie to demand an explanation. I did not send a frantic text to Catherine. I simply went to work. This was not revenge, it was accounting. The digital revocation triggered an automatic freeze on their construction insurance and credit lines. By the time they ordered their dessert at that bistro, their $2 million project was a ticking legal time bomb. Every brick laid under those permits was now an uninsured liability. Every contract they had signed with investors was now technically in default. Inside the quiet, dark library, my monitor glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. My compassion had been a resource they had overdrafted for decades. The line of credit was officially closed. I stood in the center of the foyer of the Gilded Cage. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of wet wool, damp plaster, and decades of secrets that were starting to leak through the cracks. To anyone else, this place was a ruin. To me, it was a physical manifestation of my life within the family neglected, structurally unsound, and filled with rot that had been covered up by layers of expensive wallpaper. I walked up the warped grand staircase, my boots echoing like a countdown. Each creak of the floorboards brought back a memory I had tried to audit out of my system. I thought about the 3 jobs I worked to pay for my doctorate in history. I had spent my nights cleaning office buildings and my weekends grading papers until my eyes blurred, all while Stephanie and Gregory told me I was being dramatic for wanting a life outside their shadow. While I was calculating how many shifts I needed to cover my student loans, they were busy spending my parents' legacy. I now knew the truth about the $1,500,000 they had siphoned from the insurance policies. That money did not go to my education or my parents' wishes. That $1,500,000 bled from the estate over 2 decades was liquidated to fund Catherine's destination wedding. It was a spectacle where champagne flowed like water. While I was told the family could not afford my tuition, people often ask why victims of this kind of treatment do not just leave sooner. They look at the rotting pile of wood I was left with and wonder why I did not just walk away years ago. What they do not understand is that I was not just living in a house. I was trapped in the invisible chains of a survivor. My family did not use physical locks. They built a prison without bars. It was a psychological architecture constructed from "you are too sensitive and we are the only ones who truly care about you." In that environment, silence is not weakness. It is a survival mechanism. Compliance becomes the only currency you have to buy a moment of peace. I had been in survival mode for so long that I had forgotten I was allowed to own the light, not just sit in their shadow. For 28 years, I was their silent investor. But the grace period is over. It's time to collect the debt. With interest, they viewed our relationship as a contract, where I provided the labor and they provided the privilege of belonging. But I had finally read the fine print. I stopped in front of a moisture-stained wall in the hallway. The rot was not just in the architecture. It was in the DNA of the people who had raised me. They thought they had unmade me by leaving me this wreck of a house. But as I traced a crack in the plaster, I realized they were wrong. This house was my grandmother's final lesson. She did not leave me a grave for my parents' legacy. She left me a foundation. And unlike the glass empire Stephanie and Gregory were building on forgeries, my foundation was finally going to be built on the truth. I did not have to wait long for the counterattack. Stephanie was a narcissist, and narcissists do not retreat. They rebrand. 2 days after I froze their construction project, she did not come to my door to negotiate. She went to the public. She appeared on the Asheville Business Insider's podcast, a local show that Gregory had been sponsoring for years. I listened to the episode while I was in the kitchen of the Gilded Cage, scraping layers of grime off the original brass hardware. Her voice sounded like silk wrapped around a razor. She played the part of the grieving, bewildered aunt perfectly. "It is a tragedy, really," she told the host, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "Grace has always been complicated. We have tried to support her through her various episodes for years, but after the funeral, something just snapped. She has been trespassing at the estate, taking irreplaceable historical artifacts that belong to the family trust, and now she is attempting to extort us by interfering with our development projects. She was not just lying. She was performing character assassination. She painted me as a mentally unstable niece who had lost her grip on reality. She told the Asheville business community that my professional interference was nothing more than a bizarre vendetta born from grief. Then, she dropped the real hammer. She announced that she was filing a formal ethics complaint with the State Board of Architecture and History. She claimed my license was a liability to the public, and that I was weaponizing my credentials to settle a personal inheritance dispute. I stopped scraping the brass. I did not reach for my phone to call her and scream. I did not post a frantic defense on social media. I simply took a deep breath of the dusty Asheville air and made a note in my mental ledger. In their world, a lie told loudly enough becomes the truth. But in my world, the world of history and architecture, the truth is found in the things you cannot erase. They were not shocked by the cruelty of their own lies. They were just shocked that I had stopped playing the role of the silent victim. To them, I was still the spare at the table, someone whose reputation could be set on fire if it kept their glass empire warm. but they did not realize that my professional identity was not something they gave me, so it was not something they could take away. Marcus was not the kind of man to ask questions about family gossip or public business podcasts. He looked at a house and saw a living organism, a skeleton that either held its weight or it did not. He was a senior restoration expert who valued honesty in the bones of a building, and he was the only person I trusted to touch the gilded cage. We were working in the butler's pantry, a narrow space that smelled of damp wood and forgotten dust. The wainscoting was damp, pulling away from the wall in jagged strips. As Marcus pried back a particularly stubborn section of the aged paneling, something metallic scraped against the brickwork. He stopped, shining his work light into the narrow gap behind the wall. "You might want to see this," he said, his voice low and clinical. Tucked between the wall studs was a vintage tin box, blackened by decades of oxidation and neglect. It was not a hidden treasure in the fairy tale sense. It was a hidden reality. I took the box and opened it on the pantry counter. My hands were steady, but my mind was already running the numbers. Inside were 3 small, meticulously kept accounting ledgers, wrapped in plastic to protect them from the mountain moisture. These were not my grandmother's personal journals. They were secret account books for the family firm, Asheville Heritage Holdings. I leafed through the pages, my eyes tracking the columns of figures. It was all there. The wire transfers, the shell company names, and the offshore account numbers that Stephanie and Gregory thought had been deleted from the digital world. They had siphoned exactly $1,500,000 from my parents' life insurance and trust funds over the last 20 years. It was not just a betrayal. It was a decades-long forensic audit waiting to happen. In the back of the 3rd ledger, I found a single business card with a handwritten note from my grandmother. The name on the card was Patrick, a man she had mentioned to me in riddles during my childhood, calling him the guardian of the gate. I realized then that Patrick was not just an old friend. He was the contingency plan. I called the number on the card at 2:05 p.m. When a man with a gravelly, professional voice answered, I did not exchange pleasantries. "My name is Grace," I said. "I am Margaret's granddaughter, and I have found the bones she left for me." There was a pause, a short intake of breath. "I have been waiting for this call for a long time," he replied. Patrick confirmed that the Financial Crimes Division had already flagged the firm's suspicious wire transfers months ago. My forensic evidence was simply the final puzzle piece they needed to execute the warrants in real time. Patrick was an agent with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We met 2 hours later at a quiet park outside the city limits. I handed over the ledgers, not as a grieving relative, but as a technical whistleblower. This was the shift from family drama to a criminal battle. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now the federal government was stepping in to collect. As Patrick initiated the formal forensic audit of the stolen $1,500,000, I felt a different kind of peace. Agent Patrick sat across from me in a small, windowless office that felt as cold and sterile as a vault. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound in the room, a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise Stephanie had been making on her podcasts. He did not offer me coffee, and I did not ask for any. This was not a social visit. It was a debrief. He laid out a thick blue folder and tapped a document he called the Disinheriting Codicil. This was the match my grandmother had promised me. This was the fire that would burn their glass castle to the ground. Patrick explained the first legal anomaly. Stephanie and Gregory never officially wed to bypass the bloodline trust restrictions. By remaining single on paper, Stephanie could exploit a specific loophole in the direct lineage clause, siphoning funds while pretending to be a loyal daughter rather than a wife with a non-descendant spouse. Without a legal marriage, Stephanie had no standing to act as a co-beneficiary. Their entire claim to the $1,500,000 was built on a foundation of civil fraud. But that was just the technicality. The criminal reality was much darker. Patrick handed me a magnifying glass and pointed to a scanned copy of my parents' life insurance claim. The fraudulent change of beneficiary forms for the $1,500,000 had been submitted while my parents were unconscious in the intensive care unit using a forged power of attorney. The signatures were perfect mimics of their usual script, but functionally impossible. Inside the matchbox my grandmother had hidden in that tin box was a set of digital access codes. Those codes unlocked a secure server, where she had preserved evidence they thought had been scrubbed from the earth. It was proof that Stephanie and Gregory had forged my parents' names on the trust fund, withdrawals, and insurance claims, while my parents were literally fighting for their lives. My grandmother had not just been watching them. She had been building a case that spanned 20 years. This was not a family dispute over a house on a hill anymore. This was forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny. The family drama had officially been upgraded to a federal criminal investigation. My aunt and uncle had spent 20 years playing a high-stakes game of pretend, but they had forgotten that I was a historian. I do not just look at the surface of things. I look at the bones. And the bones of this family were made of theft. Stephanie and Gregory did not waste any time. 3 days after I froze their construction permits, they organized a private estate liquidation at the Grand Asheville Hotel ballroom. They were trying to sell off my grandmother's antique furniture, her art collection, and the last of her jewelry to generate enough liquid cash to fight the stop work orders. They thought they could outrun the truth if they had enough money to hire more expensive lawyers. They invited the Asheville elite, serving imported champagne and acting as if this auction was a choice rather than a desperate act of survival. I arrived at the hotel at 2 p.m. precisely. Catherine was standing near the stage, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, laughing with the auctioneer. When Stephanie spotted me walking through the gilded double doors, she did not look frightened. She looked annoyed. She marched over to me, her voice dropping to a sharp, controlled hiss so the guests would not hear. The Bloodline Trust specifically excludes any descendant engaged in disgraceful conduct, and we've officially flagged your professional sabotage as such. You're no longer an heir, Grace. You're just a trespasser. You should not be here, Grace, she said. We have already discussed this. The gilded cage was your share. These items belong to the direct heirs. Go back to your pile of rot and stay there. I did not shout. I did not even argue. I simply stepped aside as Agent Patrick and 6 federal marshals walked into the ballroom. The auctioneer's gavel was poised to fall on my grandmother's 19th century silver tea service, a piece she had promised me when I was 10 years old. Stop the sale, Patrick announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling as he held up his badge. The room went dead silent. The elite of Asheville froze, their glasses halfway to their lips, as the marshals began cordoning off the displays with evidence tape. Stephanie's face turned a translucent shade of white, but she still tried to play the role of the victimized matriarch. She grabbed my arm, her eyes red and desperate. Grace, what is this? She pleaded, her voice rising so the whole room could hear. We are family. Think of the name. Think of the scandal. Just tell them this is a mistake and we can fix this privately. I looked at her, and for the first time, I did not feel the weight of those invisible chains. I handed her the forensic audit and a copy of the disinheriting codicil. The name died with the lies, Stephanie, I said, my voice clinical and cold, and your reputation was never yours to begin with. Watching her then, I realized the true nature of her collapse. Stephanie was suffering from what I call the illusion of the empty wallet's power. Her entire identity was built on the gilded cage of stolen wealth. She believed she was superior because she held the checkbook, not realizing that her authority was just a rental. Without the $1,500,000 she had siphoned from my parents, she had no internal foundation. The moment the money stopped flowing, her power evaporated because she had no character to support it. Gregory tried to intervene, his face purple with rage, shouting about his legal rights. Patrick did not even look up from his paperwork. You can discuss your rights with the federal judge, Patrick said. You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. They were let out past their friends, the crystal chandeliers reflecting the shame they had spent 20 years trying to hide. I stood in the center of the ballroom, not as a spare or a burden, but as the only one left standing on the truth. The legal proceedings stretched across 6 months, a grueling audit of 20 years of deceit. Stephanie and Gregory were ultimately sentenced to prison for the fraudulent misappropriation of $1,500,000. They learned too late that federal evidence does not dissolve as easily as a lie. Catherine, the golden child who once mocked my rotting inheritance, was forced to sell every designer wedding gift and luxury item she owned, just to pay the legal fees for a defense that never stood a chance. I used the recovered funds to complete the restoration Marcus and I had started. The gilded cage is no longer a monument to neglect. It is a warm, white colonial that breathes with new life. But I did not keep it for myself. I have transformed the estate into the Heritage Justice Center. It serves as a legal clinic for survivors of financial abuse and a sanctuary for architectural history. The bones of this house, which once hid secrets, now support the stories of those who are fighting to reclaim their own truth. I have come to realize that for 28 years, I was the silent investor in a version of family that never actually existed. I was the match they used to keep their glass castle warm, while I sat in the drafty shadows of their indifference. But my grandmother's riddles finally made sense. She did not want me to just find a light. She wanted me to be the match that burned their lies to the ground, so something honest could grow in the ashes. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the invisible one, the spare at the table, or the family black sheep, I want you to know that your silence was never a sign of weakness. It was a mode of survival in a prison without bars. Ripping yourself away from a toxic dynamic is not a betrayal of your blood. It is the first and most important revolution of your life. You do not owe your light to people who only want to use you as a fuel source. I have found that peace is not the absence of the past. It is the ability to look at the ruins and know you were not the one who broke them. You are allowed to build a home where you are the guest of honor, and you are allowed to walk away from anyone who refuses to see your worth. If you have ever had to find your own light in a dark house, share this story. Let us show the world that no matter how deep the lies are buried, the truth always finds its way out of the foundation.